Hey there, so today's topic is called the ego's use of time versus the holy instant. I hope you can see this little drawing I made behind me. We're going to get all of that in the segment. I want to start this segment with a quote from lesson 7 in the workbook. It says, "Old ideas about time are very difficult to change because everything you believe is rooted in time and depends on your not learning these new ideas about it. Yet that is precisely why you need new ideas about time." I thought that was a nice quote to start our session. In the previous segment, it was called Purpose, the Final Frontier of Spirituality. We spoke about the ego's goal, which is to prevent us from returning to the mind where we can make a choice against it. Our own goal when we're with the ego is to avoid the mind where we believe God waits to kill us because of our sin. Now let's see how the ego uses time to reach this goal. And once we have discussed the ego's use of time, we will then set this against the Holy Spirit's correction, which is what the Course calls the holy instant. As with so many concepts in the Course, it's helpful to first look at the problem, in this case the ego's use of time, and then apply the correction to it rather than just talk about the correction. Unless we're fully aware of the problem, the solution will elude us, because for the solution to work, it must be applied to the problem. Makes sense. Now, time is an interesting concept. I'm sure you noticed that sometimes it passes so quickly, we have no idea where it went. And at other times it passes so slowly, it is as if it literally slows down, right? And time is tricky because the mind itself, being timeless, is yet fully identified with and immersed in time while being completely independent of it in reality. The Course says that time is a trick, a sleight of hand, a vast illusion. That is in the workbook, lesson 158. So for me, it is as if or to describe time, it is as if we ride on one of those very slow-moving trams in a city where we can jump on and off at any time. And we, as the decision-making mind, are only in time because of our choice. We're not born in time, we do not die in time, and we are never in time. We simply jumped onto the tram and now believe we can't get off. We jumped onto the tram because we believe that if we wouldn't be in time or on the tram, God would catch up with us and take back the life we have stolen from him. While we are in time, we are safe, quote unquote, from his wrath. That's what we believe. So basically, we fled into timelessness because timelessness has become a battleground. Timelessness is where God is, and we cannot go back to timelessness. We need to be in time in order to be safe. That's what the ego told us, and that's what we believe. So let's talk about the ego's use of time and its purpose of binding us to it. Time is an ego device, and as such, it serves its purpose. The Course says, delay is of the ego, because time is its concept. And that is in chapter 5, section 3 of the text. So, the place within our mind where we can decide for the Holy Spirit and against ego is not in time, but it is in timelessness. We cannot decide against the ego while we are in time. That is very important. Just like we can't stand still while we're on the tram. Only when we jump off can we stand still, and only when we stand still can we remember God. The Course says, the memory of God comes to the quiet mind. If the mind is busy, the memory of God cannot dawn upon the mind. And that is in the chapter 23 of the text, section 1. So while we are in time, we cannot decide for God. I know this sounds abstract at first, but once we realize how the ego uses time, it will become crystal clear. So let's talk about what time is. In general, in layman's terms, time consists of the past, the present, and the future. And we seem to move from the past through the present into the future. So far, so good, right? Now, here's how the ego uses those 3 time zones for its own purposes. For the ego, the past is sin, the present is guilt, and the future is fear. For the ego, sin is our past, because in this sinful past we have betrayed God, even killed him when we decided that we wanted to be an individual. When we took the tiny mad idea of the possibility of separating from God seriously, the ego told us that this was a sin, and this belief in sin became our past. It is always our past when we're with the ego. In the ego, we have no past other than sin. We always killed God, and, quote, the stain of blood can never be removed, and anyone who bears this stain on him must meet with death. That is in the Manual for Teachers, section 17, paragraph 7. For the ego, this is eternity. We are sinful in perpetuity. Whatever we might do, however much time might go by, and however much we atone for our sin, it will always be there. Time depends on it, and the ego depends on time to prevent us from ever choosing against it. The ego guards time as its greatest treasure against our departure from it. If sin is our past, what can be our present except guilt? We experience guilt now for a sinful past. We don't see this guilt in us most of the time, but we do see it in other people. Our present moment is filled with judgments about others in the hope that we can get rid of this guilt we believe is inherent in us. The present moment is guilt while we are with the ego. If we were to experience this guilt directly and without buffer, we would be so terrified, we would immediately search for a solution. The Course says, and the pain in this mind is so apparent when it is uncovered that its need of healing cannot be denied. That is in chapter 13, section 3. But we don't experience this guilt directly, right? The ego would not let us do that. We only experience it indirectly, either in other people, or seeing it in other people, or through feelings like feeling irritable, anxious, restless, stressed, sleepless, ashamed, agitated, confrontational, mean, depressed, driven, extroverted, introverted, frail, weak, and so on. Because we believe the causes for all those thoughts and feelings are outside of us, the ego is safe. This is our present, and for the ego, the present is eternal. The future, while we are with the ego, is fear. Because of our sinful past and because of our guilty present, Fear of the future is the logical conclusion of this unholy trinity of time the ego has arranged for us. We must be afraid of the future because there's always the chance that God finds us and takes his revenge. And even though we might not seem to be afraid at times, it's only because we have built a life that gives us security. Without that, fear would stare us in the face again because it was there all along. Now, it's important to note that sin, guilt, and fear appear together just as past, present, and future appear together. That is the continuity of the ego thought system. Now, with this in mind, going back to the ego's purpose of never allowing us to return to the mind where we could make a choice, if you would indulge me for a simple exercise and take 15 seconds trying not to think about anything starting now. Or you can lie in bed at night and try not to think. It is impossible. Buddhists have tried it, have tried to go beyond the thoughts. It won't work. It will work eventually, but there's a reason it is extremely hard. Those thoughts we think presently are there for a reason. It doesn't matter what we think. Good thoughts, bad thoughts, ugly thoughts, beautiful thoughts. The problem is never what we think, positive or negative. The problem is that we think. The problem is the purpose our thinking has when we're with the ego. When we're with the ego, the purpose of our thoughts is to block our access to the place in our mind where we could make another choice. Time, as arranged by the ego, completely skips the present moment, the only time where we could decide against it. Because our past is sinful, we experience guilt at present and are so preoccupied with getting rid of this guilt, or so preoccupied with what will happen in the future, we don't pause and let the present moment stand. Let it open the door to the experience of love that awaits us on the other side. The ego has no use for the present moment other than to show us how guilty we are, or to show us how guilty others are, which is the very same thing. Remember that it's the ego's emphasis, quote, remember that it's the ego's emphasis on guilt enables it to ensure its continuity by making the future like the past and thus avoiding the present. That is in the text, chapter 13, section 4. Again, the ego's prime directive is to lead us away from the present moment in either direction. It can be accomplished through beautiful memories, lovely things to come, or through terrible memories and a cruel future. It does not matter whether our past and future are good or bad. Both prevent us from reaching the place in our mind where we can and would decide for God. In lesson 8 in the workbook, Jesus tells us the following. It says, the purpose of the exercises for today is to begin to train your mind to recognize when it is not really thinking at all. While thoughtless ideas preoccupy your mind, the truth is blocked. Recognizing that your mind has been merely blank, rather than believing that it is filled with real ideas, is the first step to opening the way to vision. That is in the workbook lesson 8. Again, what we think does not matter. All thoughts have as their purpose to block the truth. That's why those early lessons in the workbook are so important, even though they seem light and easy. They are as profound as the rest of them when it comes to what they say, what they actually mean. So it's important to note that we cannot escape the ego thought system within the ego thought system. We cannot escape this past, present, and future continuum within the ego thought system. It is designed not to be escaped from. The belief in our sin is the source of our thoughts. Each time we think about the past, the present, or the future, our guilt was the source of that. The Course says every disordered thought is attended by guilt at its inception and maintained by guilt in its continuance. That is in the text, chapter 5, section 5. So a football player with the ball in hand races toward the 100-yard line, and all the players of the opposing team have as their only goal to prevent him from a touchdown. That is the ego thought system. We are the football player with the ball in hand, and the ego is the opposing team trying to prevent us from getting there. I'm just wondering when I should talk about this, so I'm going to talk about this briefly right now. So we've already talked about it, but this is just basically a graph, and for now we're kind of interested just here. So we have sin as the past, we have guilt as the present, and we have fear of the future, and that is the ego's use of time. This is all the ego's use of time, right? And this is all in the mind. And guilt, literally, because guilt is in the present moment, and guilt blocks the access to the truth. Guilt blocks the access to the part of our mind where we can decide against the ego. It's like when you're in a bathtub and the bath is filled with water, and the little thingy that you put in to prevent the water from getting out, if you turn this around, that little thingy, the stopper, that is guilt. So we said that within the ego, we're skipping the present moment altogether, right? Other than seeing guilt. This is because we do not and we cannot see the present while we are with the ego. This moment here is blocked. We are either preoccupied with the past, with the sin, or with our guilt that we see in the other person, and we're afraid of the future. We do not have access to the present moment. The Course says in lesson 8, it says the header of this lesson is called "My Mind is Preoccupied with Past Thoughts." It says, this idea, of course, is the reason why you only see the past. No one really sees anything. He sees only his thoughts projected outward. The mind's preoccupation with the past is the cause of the misconception about time from which your seeing suffers. Your mind cannot grasp the present, which is the only time there is. It therefore cannot understand time and cannot in fact understand anything. Again, that's in the workbook, lesson 8. So we cannot grasp the present. We cannot go above this line in this narrow funnel, because guilt, our present moment, is filled with our guilt. That's why we can't get to that other part, the holy instant. The present moment is actually really the ego's greatest enemy, because only in the present can we decide against it, right? When we're with the ego, we must believe in our own sin, and whatever we see shows us this sin in one way or another. We never see anyone who they really are, because we only see our own sins in them. When we're with the ego, we believe in our own sin, Guilt is our present, and that is why guilt is all we see in the present, based on our belief in sin. We cannot see anything else when we're in the ego other than guilt in one way, shape, or form. So what is the solution to all this? It is what the Course calls the holy instant. How do we reach it? The Course says that instant is our goal, for it contains the memory of God. That is in the workbook, part 2. Introduction to part 2. So how do we get to the holy instant? This is the holy instant, right? The little star. How do we get there? I think this is a question a lot of Course students ask. We ask ourselves quite often. Let's recap briefly what keeps us from it. So as the holy instant is outside of time and only accessible in the present moment, we can access it by returning to the present moment. How do we do that when our mind is preoccupied with the past and the future and the guilt of the present? We can get there by looking at what is blocking the access. And what is blocking the access is guilt. So let's start with what we experience. As we said above, we are usually preoccupied with seeing guilt in other people, so we don't have to see it within ourselves. We might be feeling, as I said above, irritable, anxious, restless, stressed, sleepless, ashamed, agitated, confrontational, frail, weak, etc. We feel all those things because this prevents us from coming in contact with the guilt all those other thoughts were there to deny and to hide. So the first thing to do is to recognize that whatever we think and feel, in whatever shape it comes to us, is actually guilt. We believe in this guilt because we believed in the ego that told us that we're sinful. I think it's important to note that this is not a theoretical process. We're not speaking about abstract concepts. The guilt we try so hard to hide feels very real and is real for us. After all, denying it was our life's purpose until this very moment. Its undoing is not an easy process by any means. This is not a light and happy experience to look at our guilt. So in order to get to the holy instant, we must first look at the guilt that blocks the access to it. There's no way around it. Yes, we get inklings occasionally of what the holy instant is, but in order for us to want to go there consistently, we must learn not to be afraid to look at the guilt that blocks it. When we look at it with Jesus, in time, its unreality becomes apparent, but this can only happen when we actually look. Now, the ego's worst nightmare is for us to look at this guilt openly and without fear with Jesus or the Holy Spirit by our side. So it will try to prevent us from going there by any means necessary. Jesus looks at the guilt with us, and he's the one we will see when we have learned to look past the guilt. So he is here. It says, or he says, I stand within the holy instant as clear as you would have me. So Jesus is right here, right? We are the decision-making mind that is looking at the guilt. By doing that, we stop the flow of time. We go outside the tram. We jump off the tram. We're standing still. We're looking at the guilt in the present moment. And Jesus looks with us at the guilt from his perspective, from the holy instant. He's in the holy instant and he's looking at the guilt with us. Krishnamurti, I believe, said, and I'm not 100% sure if he said it, but I think he said, stay with the pain. And Jesus would say, stay with the guilt. This does not mean we wallow in it, but if we can resist trying to escape it for a while and ask Jesus or the Holy Spirit for help, that's the way out. We escape guilt through projecting it outward. Okay, doggies. So we escape guilt through projecting it outward. Our whole being is programmed by us in conjunction with the ego not to look at this guilt within and to avoid it at all cost through seeing it outside. So to stop moving and looking at it, to take back our projections, is a skill that needs to be learned over time. That's the process with the Course, is learning to look at our guilt and not be frightened by it. Guilt only seems solid while we don't look. It says, this heavy-seeming barrier, this artificial floor that looks like rock, is like a bank of low, dark clouds that seem to be a solid wall before the sun. He's talking about the guilt. Its impenetrable appearance is wholly an illusion. It gives way softly to the mountaintops that rise above it and has no power at all to hold back anyone willing to climb above it and see the sun. It is not strong enough to stop a button's fall nor hold a feather. Nothing can rest upon it, for it is but an illusion of a foundation. Try to touch it and it disappears. Attempt to grasp it and your hands hold nothing. That is in the text, chapter 18, section 9. Looking at guilt is not an easy thing to do. And speaking from my own experience, when I'm in this space and I'm looking at the guilt, my temptation to project it outward is very strong, to project it onto another person, make somebody else responsible. And I almost always have to say, no, come back, and stay with it. Stay with the guilt and ask Jesus for help. Whenever we look at someone and become aware of our judgment of them, we can remind ourselves that it is our guilt we see, and we can ask Jesus or the Holy Spirit for help to see it differently. If we can stay with this uncomfortable feeling for a bit, with the conviction that we will pass through it to the light eventually, it will get better over time. It's always the same guilt we see, expressed in many, many shapes and forms throughout our lives. Now, this is my interpretation of the holy instant. Might not be yours. It just made so much sense to me that the holy instant is not, or what the Course describes as the holy instant is not this light-filled moment. It is, but it is not at the same time. The holy instant is the moment when we can look at the guilt while asking for help. We might not feel any different for a while, but the very looking means that we are standing at the gate to the holy instant, and from there, eternity stretches out in front of us and peace awaits on the other side. So the moment we look at the guilt, it starts to dissolve. And when guilt starts to dissolve, the blocks to the truth dissolve. And the holy instant shines upon us, right? Shines into our mind. The holy instant is not necessarily a spiritual experience. In fact, it most often is not. It is, however, the moment closest to our awareness of love's presence within us, even though it might feel just the opposite. The very moment when we are looking at our guilt without judgment, we are nearest to the place in our mind the ego tries us to get away from. We are one step from heaven and one step from home. Because usually we're either in the past or in the future or in this projecting guilt outward. When we take the projections back and we look straight at the guilt, we are so close to the present moment that once we look at the guilt and it starts to dissolve, we slip right into the holy instant. But we can't go to the holy instant without going through the guilt. This is the key. The gate to the holy instant is looking at the guilt. That's why we say things like, when the night is darkest, the dawn is closest, for example, right? Looking at our guilt can seem like our darkest moments, and they usually are. But it is only because it is the closest to the light within us. We are at that point, at that very moment, literally touching the light behind it. The ego tells us that when we look at guilt, we are doomed forever, and that this darkness will never end, right? The ego tells us that the course is not about looking at guilt. The ego tells us the course is about love and forgiveness and light-filled blah, 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 whatever, right? The ego's purpose is for us to never get to this place, to go into the holy instant, and from there we can choose to go home. That is the worst nightmare scenario for the ego, is for us to reach this point. We are 2 feet away from the touchdown, and 10 players try to get us and grab us and pull us back. Because the ego knows once we're here, once we look at the guilt, actually looking at it and make this our purpose with the course, it's finished. Because once this starts to dissolve, we will experience the holy instant. So the ego's fear of us not reaching this place within us and deciding against it, that's what makes time so difficult. This time of looking at the ego is so difficult because the ego knows once we're through this, we're home. And once we're home, the ego's finished, right? So it wants to keep us in here, in the sin and in the fear and seeing guilt outside, so we never look at it within us. This is so hard because we're not dislodged from the ego yet. We think the ego's fear is our own fear, right? The ego is afraid that we abandon it and just go home. And because we're so identified with the ego still, we think the ego's fear is our fear. And it takes a while to dislodge from the ego. We think we actually will die if we cross the threshold. If we go up here, we believe we will die. Literally. We will cease to exist. The only thing that convinces us that this is not true is our actual looking at the guilt and realizing over time that we are looking at nothing. But we can't look at nothing until we look at it. The child that thinks there's a monster in the closet must open the closet. Until the child opens the closet, it will always think there's a monster in it. Even though somebody else would say, no, there's no monster, don't worry about it. It will always think that way. In the back of its head, it will always think there's a monster until it opens the doors, looks inside, and sees there's nothing there. So, when we stand before this holy instant, we're still attracted to the guilt in all its forms, but we're ready to question our guilt despite the pain. We will most likely also have gotten an inkling of the pull that comes from God towards us. The purpose of guilt was to cover it, to hide it forever from our awareness. This pull from God, this attraction we feel to Him, this yearning we feel towards our home, our guilt is the block. It blocks this attraction. It blocks this yearning. Right? You can't feel yearning while you feel guilt. You have to go through the guilt, and all of a sudden you feel that yearning, and this will lift us up to the holy instant. And once we look at the guilt, once we actually look at the guilt with Jesus or the Holy Spirit, this pull from God to us and from us to God will be exposed. And its strength will eventually pull us across the threshold. Right? The Course says that God takes the last step. That is the last step. The last step is not that God reaches down and grabs us. The last step is that the attraction from us, this pull from God to us, from our Father, from the Father to us as His children, is no longer blocked by this guilt. Once this is exposed, the attraction will pull us up. Our attraction to love and love's attraction to us will pull us up. That's the final step that the Course talks about. And it says here in the text, chapter 15, section 2, it says, "Start now to practice your little part in separating out the holy instant. You will receive very specific instructions as you go along. To learn to separate out this single instant, this single second, and to experience it as timeless is to begin to experience yourself as not separate." To separate out this single second is to look at our guilt right now, the guilt that we feel right at this very moment, and look at it with Jesus, and then we pass through it. So I personally don't think, and that might be different for other people, but for me, I can't work toward experiencing the Holy Spirit, the holy instant, right? I think we can, but not in the way we think. I believe we all believe we can simply somehow go to it and experience it, right? I don't think this is the case. But I think we can practice getting so close to it, and that can happen. And then the Holy Spirit the holy instant can happen naturally. And learning how to look at our guilt with Jesus or the Holy Spirit, that's the preparation for the holy instant. And in order to experience it, we must want it more than anything else, more than guilt, more than fear, and more than the ego. We must want the Holy Spirit more than judging our brother. But as an effect of that, we must honestly look at, is this true? Do we want the Holy Spirit? Do we want the holy instant? Or do we want to judge our brother? And if we're not experiencing the holy instant, we are judging our brother. We must want to experience the holy instant. And in order to want it, really what has to happen is for us to lose the fear, our fear of it. And we lose that fear of the holy instant by diminishing our belief in sin. Because belief in sin brought us to the experience of the guilt, which then makes us afraid of the holy instant. It says here, the holy instant has not happened to you, has not yet happened to you. Yet it will, and you will recognize it with perfect certainty. No gift of God is recognized in any other way. You can practice the mechanics of the holy instant and will learn much from doing so, which is looking at our guilt. Yet its shining and glittering brilliance, which will literally blind you to this world by its own vision, you cannot supply. And here it is, all in this instant, complete, accomplished, and given wholly. That is the text, chapter 15, section 2. So we cannot supply the holy instant ourselves. We cannot create it. We cannot make us go there, right? If we were to be able to just go to the holy instant, we would. Because if we would wholly want the holy instant, we would experience it. We don't experience it because we don't want it wholly, right? We don't want it unequivocally. We want to see our brother as guilty. That's what we want. We don't want the Holy Spirit, the holy instant, and that's what we have to look at with Jesus. So not only don't we need to establish the holy instant, we don't have to try to reach it because we are actually already there. We are standing within the holy instant together with Jesus already, but we have our eyes closed to it. Because time is an illusion made up by the ego, we are here and have always been there because separation is impossible. And we are only always in the holy instant, that in this holy instant we're joined with God and we're home, right? We have never left it, so we are always there. But we have our eyes closed. And trying to reach it does not do anything, because the moment we wholly want it, we will recognize that we are there. What we need to do is remove the blocks from our awareness, and that is done through looking at our guilt and our belief in sin. That's how we gain access to the holy instant. So in one way, the holy instant is the counterpoint to the ego's use of time, right? For the ego, sin, guilt, and fear is one uninterrupted flow from a sinful past through a guilty present to a fearful future. And the present moment is the only access point to the holy instant. And we get there by stopping the stream of time and looking at our guilt right now. And that's what opens the door. If we don't look, we will stay in the ego's stream of time, because not looking is what protects the ego. So the other thing is, this block, this guilt, only appears solid from a distance. The closer we get, and once we get closer to it and we ask Jesus or the Holy Spirit for help, it becomes more like a fog that we walk through. And the closer we get to the blocks, the more we realize that they are illusory. The further we are away from them, the more solid they appear. That's why Krishnamurti said, stay with the pain, and Jesus says, stay with the guilt, because the moment we are actually looking at the guilt right now, we're sitting in this painful moment where we realize we feel guilty, or the guilt that we have projected out onto somebody else is actually our guilt. It's that moment of just sitting with it for a second and asking Jesus for help. And the more we do that, the more we realize that it has no substance. The substance is only when we look at it from a distance. Then it's a solid block. All right. Now I have one final comment which occurred to me it's a connection between a line, what I think is one of the most beautiful lines in the course. It is in the chapter "For They Have Come," chapter 26. And it says there, "The holiest of all the spots on earth is where an ancient hatred has become a present love." That is in chapter 26, section 9. So I was thinking about that, and I thought that time and space make the physical universe, what the Course calls the illusory world, right? The line that I just read talks about the space aspect, the holiest of all the spots on earth, right? That talks about a specific spot in space. The equivalent in time would be the holiest of moments in time. So in the space aspect, the holiest of spots on earth is where an ancient hatred has become a present love, is when we have looked at our hatred with Jesus, and this has opened the door to the love that lies beyond it. And once we have opened the hatred to the love that lies beyond it, even the most hateful spot on earth becomes an expression of the love that was hidden by the hatred. And I think the very same applies to the holy instant. The above line would read as follows: "The holiest of all the moments in time, aka the holy instant, is where an ancient hatred has become a present love." And how we do that is we transform an ancient hatred by looking at the guilt within us with Jesus or the Holy Spirit. As a closing, I would like to read the first paragraph of the epilogue to the whole course. It's the very, very end of the course in the clarification of terms, the epilogue of the clarification of terms. It says here, "Forget not, once this journey is begun, the end is certain. Doubt along the way will come and go to come again. Yet is the ending sure. No one can fail to do what God appointed him to do. When you forget, remember that you walk with him and with his word upon your heart. Who could despair when hope like this is his? Illusions of despair may seem to come, but learn how not to be deceived by them. Behind each one there is reality, and there is God. Why would you wait for this and trade it for illusions, when his love is but an instant further on the road where all illusions end? The end is sure and guaranteed by God. Who stands before a lifeless image when a step away the Holy of the Holies opens up an ancient door that leads beyond the world?" Thanks for watching.